This is Jeff Steiner with the Dad's Resource Center. Dad's Resource Center was founded by Dr. Jolynn Myers to provide education resources and advocacy for single fathers who are struggling to be in the lives of their children due to involvement with the family court, county, and human services systems. Since 2016-17, we've had over 200 fathers reach out to us. And I think there's a pretty broad recognition that while there are some fathers who need to be incentivized and helped to step up and do what they need to do, there are a lot of good fathers out there who want to be in the lives of their children and aren't able to, and are being denied that ability to do so. And so we as an organization, we provide mentoring, coaching, best practices for fathers who are going through some of these things. It's tough when you're going through it. Nothing can cut at the core of any parent, but a father specifically, then wanting to be there for their children, be there day to day or routinely, and be able to provide them with the love, the nurturance, the guidance that they need. Parents need both. Children need both parents active in their upbringing to have the best shot at being successful in life. And it's a disservice to the children while the fathers go through immense pain, and it's unfair to them. The real victims are the children when they can't have their fathers in their lives. And so while we try to help fathers individually like that, we do a lot of things from an advocacy standpoint. And one of the things we like to do is look at other people who are out there working on behalf of parents and fathers to do their part for the many different ways that fathers are denied or hindered from being in their children's lives. And so with me today, I have Brian Martin, and he's a citizen of Pennsylvania, and I encountered what he's doing and looked into it a little bit, and I'm impressed with all the background he's done on the topic he's going to be talking about today, as well as the effort that he's put into and the time that he's put into trying to be able to make some changes, to be able to balance things out for fathers. So with all that being said, Brian, if you can take a minute or two to tell people a little bit about yourself.
Of course. Good morning, Jeff. Thanks for having me on your interview today. I am a parent rights advocate. I live in Eastern Pennsylvania. One of the items that I'm doing is trying to introduce a new bill into Pennsylvania that targets fathers and mothers who are alienated from their parents through false allegations of abuse. And false allegations of abuse is a very serious problem. Parents have lost custody of their children because of the false allegations of abuse, and courts just don't seem to understand the severity of it. There's hardly no due process. It's usually, over a course of one day. There's no really much of the evidence that can be introduced. It's more hearsay, and the process is very damaging to the children as well of losing a parent and having that child sent over to the parent that's going to alienate them even further. So I have a bill that I'm only introducing, and I've done lots of research about parental alienation, how it happens, why it happens. I've been studying parent alienation for about 7 years now. I have been working on some of the laws or a new law I want to introduce for about 4 years, and I have did some very in detail interviews with people for the last 2 years. The interviews range from parents who have been alienated, former prosecutors, former judges, police officers, adult children of parental alienation. So when the children grow up, they explain to me the difficulties they have in adult life when they're alienated from their parent from an early standpoint. The emotional damages of a child that's alienated from a parent will last a lifetime. They have therapies for that as well. And some of the adult children of being alienated from a parent told me about the struggles they are in with therapies, the anger issues, the emotional issues. So this problem needs to be addressed from the start, from the initial stages of the false allegations, not waiting 10, 15 years down the road before the damage has already occurred. So one of the items that I'm proposing in a bill to the senators and lawmakers is a basically a way for an alienated parent to have some type of footing in civil court. A lot of the times, a parent will get their child taken away from them in false allegations, and the damage has been done already. Financial damages, damages to the reputation, the alienation of the child. I've created a diagram called the parental alienation diagram. It's basically a pyramid. At the bottom of that pyramid is called Y, and that bottom level is the power, control, basically financial aspect of why a child would be taken away from a parent. That's the bottom. That's the why. And the middle part is called the how. And the how is either through false allegations of abuse, through a custody interference, or for brainwashing the child. And then at the top is basically child abuse, and that's child alienation. Child alienation is child abuse. What I'm trying to do is put basically a roadblock called legal consequences before that top of the pyramid gets hit, before child abuse, child alienation actually takes a part in the child's life. Having legal consequences is so that parent who has the child alienation, the false allegations of abuse, they have some type of legal recourse of action in civil court, not family court, but civil court. In civil court, there are rules of evidence that has to be followed. Civil court, there's a lot of due process that has to be followed as well. A parent can opt for a jury trial or for a bench trial, so there could be a more thorough investigation. The evidence can be laid out. In civil court, there's also a lot of discovery periods and testimonies are under oath. So unlike family court, where someone can just go in there and just shoot off a false allegation with no evidence, in civil court, there's a lot of due process. And that's what I'm trying to pursue with this new bill. In Pennsylvania, there is a law called the Dragon Eddy Act, and that law is basically called under false abusive process and wrongful use of civil proceedings. That law is very similar to what I'm trying to pass. I've known the Dragon Eddy has been used in Pennsylvania with a father that has been accused of false allegations of abuse, and it has worked. The Dragon Eddy falls short on a couple of items. The Dragon Eddy law only covers the initial false allegations of abuse. So let's say one parent goes to court and they get a protection from abuse order. That Dragon Eddy only covers all the aspects of the protection from abuse order. It doesn't cover any financial remedies for going to custody court then after the fact, because false allegations are used nonstop through the entire lifetime of child custody. The Dragon Eddy also does not cover any type of psych evals the parent has to go through as well, or any therapies that children has to go through as well. One of the biggest tactics, or one of the biggest tactics of a parent that's trying to alienate the child, is using financial stress on the other parent. And that comes from constantly going back to court to false allegations of abuse. They try to wear the other parent down financially, emotionally. They basically try to beat the other parent up in court. And this law covers, a new proposed law covers all of these items to give some type of remedy and relief for that parent. The proposed law covers all costs of the psych evaluations, including reunification therapies for the child. Having a parent taken away from a child is very devastating for both the parent and the child. I know of a case of where a parent, sent the child to school on the bus, gave, a hug to their son on the bus, and later that day, the sheriff came to the school and took the child away because of false allegations of abuse. And that parent hasn't seen that child in months because of the court system and all the false allegations of abuse and psych evaluations. So that emotional damage of having that child taken away from you unexpectedly, same as a child, is very devastating to both the child and the parent. And this bill covers all the types of therapy that's needed. The other item that it covers is all the court costs and attorney fees. I know parents that spent $50, $60, $70,000 to defend themselves in criminal court, only to be proven not guilty, or only to have that in family court that they spent all this money, but then the judge is like, oh, well, we're not going to reprimand the parent that made the false allegations of abuse. And by that time, the damage has already been done, especially in the financial aspect. The third thing, or the fourth thing, is the emotional damages, like I've covered. Having a child taken away from you as a parent is very emotional. Um, I've known stories of parents that actually committed suicide, sadly enough, because their kids were taken away from them, and their family basically proven that parents' innocence after the fact. So this is a very devastating item that occurs in the United States. There are facts out there. United States in 2020, there was a report by the Prosecutor Integrity Board. They listed about 20.4 million adult Americans are falsely accused of child abuse. Out of that 20.4 million, about 27% of those allegations were in the context of a disputed child custody case, which is about 5.5 million adults. That's a lot of false allegations of abuse, 5.5 million. That's a tremendous amount. So this problem isn't just, a once and done occurrence. This is occurring for a very long time. There are a lot of experts that have written books about this, and the numbers prove that this is an item that needs to be addressed, and making a new law to cover, the aspects of this. Out of those parents, I actually did, out of that 5.5 million, I did do a lot of interviews overseas and international, from Canada, Australia, Spain, Germany. A lot of these false allegations, this isn't just to the United States, this is abroad, this is international, on international level, of these parents doing these false allegations of abuse. And all these stories I've interviewed, all the people I've interviewed, they follow the same course of action. You can see that the footsteps are exactly the same, how they do it, why they do it. And having this law has a framework to stop these footsteps until they hit the child alienation part. And that's what I'm trying to do with this new proposed law.
So I'd like to take a moment to put a little bit of background to this, so folks have a little bit of an understanding of why this is necessary or why this is a problem. Um, the domestic violence awareness movement started back in the 1970s, and for a very good reason. I mean, there are a lot of fatalities, a lot of really horrible situations that were arising, and rightfully so. People began to start creating an awareness of this, and also implementing the systems, the organizations that could be able to help assist for those people who are in abusive situations. It's been pretty much half a decade since this movement started, and it's been broadly successful. The number of instances of fatalities are much lower now than what they had been, and there are less people who are living with, or in some sort of a situation where they're in a dynamic or a relationship with someone who is abusive, because of this effort, and it's to be applauded. And certainly anyone within the fatherhood movement is supportive of domestic violence awareness and domestic violence interventions. As men, and I say this not to be negative, not to be negative in any way, shape, or form, but men do not raise hands against women or children or do harm to other people, and that's what we're supporting as men and fathers. Unfortunately, the situations that you are bringing to light, and it's pretty much common knowledge that these systems are misused. They're misappropriated in these situations where you have contentious custody situations with children at times. And it's one of the things you hear referred to as part of the playbook. There are a couple of different things like this that are at hand, that are utilized. And it's a disservice to the cause of domestic violence in helping to keep those people safe, to be able to have it mimicked in this way or misused in this way. And we want to be able to find a way to be able to help limit the ability of people to misuse these things that are there for a very good reason. And so this is what you're proposing with this. And I can tell you, again, we've had over 200 fathers reach out to the Dad's Resource Center. Roughly a third of them have relayed to us that there was a misuse of a protection from violence ruling or filing. Now, we can't know everything that goes on with all those situations. I do know a good number of those. I've talked to them. I've looked at documents. I've attended hearings. And I can see where, in their view, it's being misused, in that you're dealing with situations where that the person has not acted in violence towards the mother or the children, has not made any overt or substantial threats of harm or acted in any way along those lines. I've seen PFAs, and I need to take a step back. The way the system works in PFA is initially you file for a temporary PFA. This can be approved automatically, and again, for good reason. You need quick and early interventions in these situations. And so that a magisterial judge, not just a court, a county judge, can approve these things if it's off hours on a weekend or something along these lines. And there's a low threshold to approve a temporary PFA. Supposedly within 2 weeks' time, I believe it is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, you have to have a hearing.
Yep, it's 2 weeks.
Right? To be able to say, okay, let's look at all the evidence and everything involved with this to say whether or not we're going to keep this PFA in place or to actually do an official PFA. Now, these things most often get extended, particularly if there are attorneys involved. And it is not 2 weeks far too often, especially because they can get extensions for this or extensions for that. So it can be months before someone who is under a PFA actually gets to have that initial hearing for a temporary PFA. What happens oftentimes for fathers is, as a tactic, they drag it out until the actual hearing for the temporary PFA. An hour before, half an hour before, I have sat there and watched this happen, where the attorney doesn't even say anything really. Both the attorney for the mom and the dad, in these instances, huddle up in a room or something, and they come up with some sort of deal. And then the father's attorney comes out and says, well, they'll agree to drop the PFA filing if you agree to this, that, and this. Now, even though and this is a tough spot for a lot of fathers to be in, because as men, you don't want to admit to something you really didn't do or something that you don't believe is right. But most often your attorney's saying, most more likely if you go back in there, they're going to approve the PFA. And so the fathers put up against it, and they have to then agree to these things to be able to have the PFA dropped altogether. What judges sometimes do is they extend the temporary PFA. So even though it should only be for 2 weeks, the judge has the ability to say, well, I'm going to extend it for another 6 months. And so the father has a temporary PFA lingering over them for these 6 months, where it can just take some sort of a bad judgment, a text, like any kind of communication when you have a PFA is a violation of the PFA. It can result in a felony consequence and time in jail and all these other things. And Brian also highlighted the human aspect of this, the tension and the stress for the father, but also the view of the children. Like, what's going on with this? I have a father, and otherwise has been, my dad. But now they're saying this person is an abusive person, or there's all these constraints from outside involved. And so this is sort of the background, just some of the background. And there are many people who could come and share their stories about how this exact process is repeatable and happened to them just as it happened to many, many other people. And so this is what Brian is proposing, to try to get some sort of intervention in place so that these systems meant to protect women and children primarily are not being misused in a way that they are not intended to be used. Brian?
That's a good point, Jeff. And there's another thing I want to touch base on is, how does this new proposed law protect actual victims of abuse. Like you're saying, the PFA system is there to protect actual victims of abuse. And this is something that took me about a year or two through interviews, because I did interview actual victims of abuse. And through that interviews, and I actually interviewed a former prosecutor of Virginia, and we've made something called a 3-tier qualification. And that 3-tier qualification means all 3 tiers have to be satisfied so we don't have victims being sued by their abusers. And in those 3-tier qualification, the first item is the initial stage. The original filing must be dismissed or withdrawn. So in this case, for a PFA hearing, the initial PFA has to be dismissed or withdrawn, or they say sometimes found not guilty or not substantiated. Same difference. All the wording, it has to be basically that you cannot have an active PFA against you and go try to use this new law. The second stage, a safety proximity measure must not have been agreed upon instead of going to the PFA hearing. Now, what this means is, let's say that a mother gets a PFA against a father, and the mother's attorney is like, okay, we will dismiss the PFA, but the father has to have supervised visits because there has been abuse that has happened. If that happens, or a safety proximity measure would be meeting at the police station, or one of those, or supervised visits. If that occurs, then obviously the person cannot turn around and sue the other person for false allegations of abuse, because one, you agreed to the safety proximity measure, or the judge has issued the safety proximity measure. And the third stage is there has to be evidence that, or lack of evidence, that the abuse never has occurred. And there's a story that I know where a mother got a PFA against a father, and a father actually had video evidence that he was not even at the house or at the scene. That's the type of evidence that I have in the third stage, that there's medical records, text messages, witnesses, hardcore evidence that there is, that the person wasn't even there, or that the abuse never occurred. And this third stage actually came from interviewing a prosecutor. And I didn't know this at the time until the prosecutor told me this. This prosecutor would sit and listen to phone calls when the one parent was incarcerated in prison. And a lot of times, the abuser who's incarcerated in prison will have a prison phone call with their victim, and they will convince the victim not to show up for court. They'll convince the victim, hey, I'll go to therapy. I will, get help for my anger issues, or I'll get help because I'm an alcoholic, and just don't show up for PFA hearing because you don't want the children to think that you're a bad person because you don't show up, stuff like that. And sometimes the victim does not even show up for the PFA hearing, and then that PFA hearing is dismissed. Because of this third stage, the evidence has to be clear that even if the PFA is dismissed, if there's evidence that a police record or medical records that there is abuse, in this case that there's incarceration of the parent, that has to be a safety net to protect the actual victims of abuse. So it goes both ways. This third stage goes both ways, and it's a very transparent to protect the victims of actual abuse and also to protect the victims of false allegations of abuse. And because of this third and final stage, I got a lot of good feedback from the senators. I got a lot of good feedback from the lawmakers that this is a transparent portion of this bill, and that helps for both parties.
Thank you for explaining that. When you gave me the slide deck here, and I went through it, I didn't quite understand, but you did a good job of filling in the gaps there with that a little bit. So you talked about, I guess you just brought it up a little bit. You've spoken to some people actually in the state capitol about this. Can you talk about that in some of your journey in doing that and how that's going for you?
Yes, currently I'm looking for I need one sponsor to get this bill for blueback, and that means that it'll be up for a vote. So I'm going around to state lawmakers, senators, state representatives, and discussing why we need this law, the cause of it and trying to do the wording. Right now, we're doing some legal wording in the proposed bill. So we have a proposed bill right now, and we're making sure that the legal wording is correct, so it cannot be manipulated by an actual abuser. And that's basically the final step. And after that, I'm going to reconvene and meet with more state lawmakers and senators and show them the proposed bill, the correct wording, that this is the final stage. This is what we're going to be voting on with the wording. So we can basically bypass that part, and it won't have to go back to the legislating committee to have another vote. So right now, like I said, I'm meeting with lawmakers. I try to reach out to at least 2 state lawmakers or 2 senators a week to schedule a meeting. And I know there's a rally coming up in Harrisburg that I will be present for as well. So I'm looking to network with some state lawmakers as well in that rally to show some numbers. Basically, like I said, there's 20.4 million cases in 2020 from that report, and about 27% of that happened in child custody court. So that I'm using my power and numbers to demonstrate why we need this bill.
Have you looked at other states? Any kind of models out there that you used for this, or to be able to support what you're doing?
Other states have very similar bills to the Dragon Eddy, like something called a slap claim, but there's nothing that targets actual false allegation of child abuse and all of those elements, the psychological, the financial, the reunification therapies. The bill provides direct and clear remedies for somebody that has a false allegations of abuse. Not just like Dragon Eddy that, is kind of putting your toe in the water and hoping that it will work. This new bill is basically a clear and direct path to a remedy. Other states have very similar, but nothing similar to what this new bill that I'm trying to propose will be.
All right. And what's your next step, or is there anything else you want to add?
Or next step, we do have a petition online on change.org where people can sign up and voice their opinion. They can either, click that they support it and leave a comment. I answer all the comments with a response, or they can just click and, sign up and say, hey, I support this bill. That petition is to show lawmakers and senators again how much support in Pennsylvania that we have for this bill. The voices, Pennsylvanians, the fathers and mothers, people that have been alienated through, child alienation, false allegations of abuse, to show support for this bill, the power in numbers.
Okay, all right. A little plug with that. We last year we were part of a statewide coalition that passed legislation to create the Pennsylvania Advisory Committee on Greater Father Involvement. The committee is currently working right now. Its primary objective is to submit a report to the General Assembly and the governor at the end of the year, laying out some of the issues and the obstacles and the problems, fatherhood in general for the state of Pennsylvania, but also some of those things and some recommendations moving forward about how we can make things more family friendly. But again, it's important to note everything we're talking about here, fathers far too often are the victims, so to speak, of some of these things that are going on. But the real victims are the children, and a lot of unnecessary uncertainty in their lives, a lot of chaos and antagonism around them when they're involved with these situations, and just unnecessary difficulties. The important thing, parents should always respectfully co-parent and work as partners. Even though they're going their own separate ways, they have a separated family and a mutual interest, which is their children. And it's on the parents to be able to work together in a reasonable, collegial manner on behalf of their children. Because again, children need both parents growing up. I know this. I didn't have a father. It wasn't exactly because of this, but it affected my life. And as Brian had noted through his work and a lot of the research that we've done through the Dad's Resource Center, when children don't have their fathers involved in their lives growing up, there are a lot of negative consequences. They more likely to end up criminal behavior, drug use, substance abuse, mental health issues, but then also the different affirmative things. They're less likely to go to college. They very clearly make less money throughout the course of their lives. They're less likely to vote, to donate to charities. Like we have the statistics from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth Survey 97 that we broke some of that down. So for the children themselves, it's important to have their fathers actively involved in their lives, for communities, for society. And we just want to be able to get Pennsylvania, the culture. There, you see a lot of this going on in other states, Florida, Texas. Some things are going on to help level the playing field and emphasize fatherhood. But we're at the forefront with what we're doing comprehensively here in Pennsylvania. And I want to laud or applaud or compliment Brian for his effort and what he's doing for this particular cause and this particular issue with all of this. So, okay.
Thanks, Jeff, for having me on today. Thank you.